Hi class, today we are going to continue our discussion about communities, and we are going to be delving into the subculture of modern urban areas. So every area, as far as whether we're talking urban, suburban, or rural, as the three main classifications of types of areas, every area has its own type of subculture. Now, part of that can be geographic, right? So it could be that rural culture in northern Canada can be different than rural culture in southern Argentina. However, there are some traits that cultures of rural, suburban, or urban subcultures have in common as far as in each individual region. So, for example, urban subculture in Tokyo will have a lot in common with urban subculture in New York City. There are obviously going to be some differences because when there are geographic differences, there are also cultural differences, but some things remain true regardless of geography and regardless of culture. So we're going to be talking about that today. So first of all, when we're talking about urban, it's really important to understand that the definition of urban has changed dramatically over time. What qualified as a major city in the 1700s is vastly different from what qualifies as a major city today. I mean, a lot of major or large cities, around 1700, had 100,000 people, or some had a little more than that. But today, some of our most populous cities, like at the time of your book's publication, Tokyo had around 37 million people. That is huge, right? It's very difficult. America didn't make the list of the top 10 largest cities, by the way. It's hard to imagine a city that has that many people. I mean, if you look at the state of Pennsylvania, okay, the state of Pennsylvania has 12, a little more than 12 million people in it. All right. So that's three times in Tokyo, three times the population of the state of Pennsylvania living in one city in one urban area. So when we're talking about urban areas, we're talking about cities. And we're generally talking about mid-sized to larger cities. Now, I would think for our region, Pittsburgh is a major city. I mean, it's one of the more populous cities in the state of Pennsylvania. Uh, However, if you look at more populous cities in America, Pittsburgh wouldn't make the list. However, Pittsburgh is a populous city as far as we're concerned regionally, and I would consider that for this discussion to be an urban area, right? So it's not rural by any stretch of the imagination, and while it does have a lot of suburban regions surrounding it, it's still an urban area. So let's talk about culture or subculture of urban areas. So some things that are distinguishing factors. First of all, obviously large population would be a distinguishing factor of an urban area, having a large population and a high population density. So people per square mile. Cities have a much larger population density than suburban areas and than rural areas. And part of that's just due to the architecture of a city. You have skyscrapers, you have taller buildings, property values are very expensive per square foot in a city as opposed to in places like suburban or rural areas. So you're going to have people living in apartment complexes or other types of housing like that. So you're going to have a higher population density, which you're going to also have a higher population density. And that's also going to lead to cities generally have greater ethnic diversity than rural areas and suburban areas. So if you look at some of the really major cities, they have ethnic centers. And if you've had me for U.S. history, which most of you had, that's part of the conversation in the history curriculum is the idea of how ethnic centers developed in cities, largely due to immigration. And a lot of cities have ethnic centers. So if you look at Pittsburgh, like Squirrel Hill would be an ethnic center, for example. And a lot of cities have places like Chinatown, Little Italy, or other ethnic regions in a city. And there are a lot of them because there's a lot of ethnic diversity in cities. So cities are generally much more known for their ethnic diversity than rural areas or urban areas. Also, another hallmark of urban subculture would be a lot more economic specialization. So you're going to have a lot more things going on that are very select in cities that you're not going to be able to find in a lot of other places, right? So the amount of food selections that you're going to have in an urban area, that would be specialization, like, Thai food, Indian food, Mediterranean food, just for some examples that you could find where you're probably not going to find in a rural area. A lot of arts that you're going to find in an urban area that you wouldn't find in a rural area. You're much more likely to find, even if you look at like the medical field, a neurosurgeon, for example, a neurologist, a cardiothoracic surgeon. You're generally not going to find those specialties in the medical field in a rural area like you would find them in an urban area. Um, as far as universities, there are universities that are in rural areas, but you're going to find a higher concentration of universities and colleges in an urban area. And a lot of times the studies that they're going to offer are going to be much more diverse, so much more specialization. Whereas if you go out into a rural area, you'll notice while there is some specialization, it's not nearly as highly specialized. So you might find some people that are into agriculture, right? You might find some people that are mechanics. You might find some people doing, different things, but there's not the same excessively high level of specialization that you're going to find in an urban area. So we see higher population density, which goes with higher population as well. We're going to see more ethnic diversity, and we're also going to see more economic specialization. So those are some hallmarks of urban areas. Um, and also, just if you think about the subculture of rural areas in this region, I don't know if you've been to rural areas, if you have friends that are in rural areas, the subculture is different than if you go downtown into Pittsburgh, or if you've been to even bigger cities, right? The culture can be different. So, for example, right, like how do you deal with street vendors in rural America? There aren't any, right? Maybe you might consider like farm stand street vendors, but if you go to New York City, there are street vendors and they can be a little aggressive in their approach, right? Like they might try to not let you pass and like show you their goods and try to get you to buy their wares, right? That would be something subcultural about a city. And some people happen to like the street vendors because you can get some really good deals. But that is just something specific that you're going to find in an urban area that you're not going to have to navigate. Also, as far as culturally in urban areas, um, you can notice the art may be different, like street art, for example. You might find more street art in an urban area. You might find actual, like art museums, art galleries, like the Mattress Factory in Pittsburgh. That's part of the subculture of Pittsburgh. The Strip District would be part of the subculture and the cultural regions of Pittsburgh. So when you're looking at the differences between urban, rural, and suburban, uh, think about Pittsburgh and how it's parceled out and the different things that you can experience downtown that you can't necessarily experience in rural areas, right? Like the Pittsburgh Macaroni Company, the PA Macaroni Company, where they have over 400 types of cheeses. You're not going to find something like that in a rural area. That's very specialized. And same with Woolies, fish market. You're not going to find something like that generally in a rural area. Because it has enough people to pull from in the city to patronize that establishment to be able to do that. So there are a lot of things in a city that allow it to develop a very unique subculture. Aside from other things, like if you look at the political affiliations in urban areas, studies have shown that urban areas generally lean more toward the political left in the United States, right? And generally, cities tend to be more on the political left, and rural regions tend to be more on the political right. But that may not hold true everywhere. But if you look at things that hold true everywhere about cities, high population density, big population, those two kind of go hand in hand. But I just want to make sure that there's a distinction there. And then as far as high amount of specialization as far as different fields go. That would be something, and then also ethnic diversity. So those would be the things that most cities have in common and that are major traits or hallmarks of cities. All right, so that is it for today. And then I just want you to also, as you're thinking through this, think about some things that you can identify as you think through this that may be hallmarks of cities or might be specific to Pittsburgh, the subculture of this region. All right, so I hope you think through this. Try to find a few things about your region and your subcultures in your region, and then we'll continue the discussion tomorrow. Have a great day.